So I'm very pleased to welcome Will Greenham, who's going to now talk to us about the eagle, the model for a generation. I hope it was our generation.
It was indeed. Right. I'm going to read this because otherwise I shall go off-piste. I want to make sure I cover it all. Good morning, anyone. For any, I've already been introduced, but I'm one of the editorial team of the Eagle Times, the Journal of the Eagle Society. My presentation's in three parts. Firstly, I'll look at the origins of Eagle and then a review of the first issue. Then I'll look at how Eagle developed its features by building on the best and addressing the rest. And the final part will be on Eagle's cultural impact and the history of Eagle appreciation. Oh, sorry. Whoops. Okay. To review how Eagle began, we need to step back to just after the Second World War. In 1945, the Reverend Marcus Morris arrived as the new incumbent at St James in Birkdale, a parish suburb of Southport in Lancashire. Finding the existing church newsletter uninspiring, he set about transforming it into a magazine, which he would call Anvil. In the process, he drew on the talents of a range of writers and contributors, including a promising student from the local art college, Frank Hampson. Frank Hampson was born in Audenshaw in Manchester, although he was raised and schooled in Southport. In the Second World War, he aspired to be a pilot, but he ended up in the Royal Army Service Corps. It was in 1945, at the receiving end of V2 rockets in Antwerp, that he was inspired to think of the more optimistic aspects of rocketry. He later wrote in the Dare Space Book, published in 1953, "On the quays of Antwerp you could watch the birth of space travel." He also said, "Space travel was born in those neat cotton wool lines reaching up into the clear blue winter sky." Those were evocative words from someone who'd witnessed close up the devastating effect of the V2's impact. After the war, Frank returned to Southport and the Victoria College of Arts and Sciences, which was where Marcus Morris found him. Hampson's artwork brought a new verve to Anvil. It grew from a modest parish magazine to one with national distribution. But while Anvil proved increasingly popular, it never made any money. Indeed, it left Morris seriously in debt, although that didn't deter him from considering other publishing enterprises. Morris had been campaigning against imported horror comics and thought he should write an inspiring adventure story with a Christian message which Hampson would illustrate as a cartoon strip. His intention then being to publish the strip in a national newspaper. When that fell through, he decided to go full out to produce a strip cartoon magazine, and Hampson greeted the idea with enthusiasm. It was a time of austerity, when food and clothing were rationed. Even the paper for comics was in short supply. But it was also a time for optimism. Britain and its allies had won the Second World War. The United Nations had been established, and a new supersonic and atomic age beckoned. What better time to inspire a generation of post-war children, and what better to inspire them with but a new colourful comic strip magazine? They set about designing a dummy that could be shown to potential publishers, with Hampson literally cutting and pasting up copies on the dining room table. The cover of the dummy showed tasters for some of the content. Not all would survive to the first issue. Dare had started with Morris's newspaper strip idea for a character called Lex Christian, who would be a chaplain in the East End of London. However, as Morris's and Hampson's ideas grew for a character that would more attract the adventurous spirits of children, he morphed into Dare. Dan was then intended to be chaplain of an interplanet patrol, tending to the spiritual needs of space patrolmen, much as chaplains do for our armed services today. And incidentally, as Morris himself had during part of the war. Work began on the dummy, or rather dummies, for several copies with variations were made in May of 1949. And soon after that, Marcus Morris, with dummies under his arm, went to London. He spent the next few months trudging the streets, sleeping rough, or trying to find a publisher, but one after another turned it down, until Holton's acceptance in October of 1949. Now, Holton Press wasn't previously a comics publisher. They published Picture Post, Farmer's Weekly, Housewife and Lilliput. But so taken were they with the originality of the concept that they bought the magazine, they hired the team that had produced it, and they appointed Morris editor. And it would seem that Holton left their editor and the Southport production team pretty much to themselves. Not previously being comics publishers, Holton's allocated the new weekly a higher budget than any other comic being published. It allowed Morris and Hampson to continue to develop their ideas, to seek out other contributors, and to assemble a team of artists to produce content under a studio system, something then unheard of in British comics. When Eagle reached the newsstands, Dan Dare was no longer a chaplain, but had morphed into a skilled space pilot, which was more Frank Hampson, the would-be pilot, than Marcus Morris, the once forces chaplain. From late 1949 until a year or so after the first issue appeared, when it moved to Epsom in Surrey, the studio was housed in Churchtown, Southport, in a former bakehouse, which was in reality no more than a lean-to shed with windows that gave a good natural light. This picture was taken 5 years ago, to this very day, on the occasion of the Eagle Society's visit to Southport to commemorate Eagle's 60th anniversary. Harold Johns, a colleague of Hampson's since art college, had already been brought in to help on Anvil. Among the new recruits were Greta Tomlinson, Terry Maloney and Bruce Cornwell. In addition to the studio team, the science fiction writer and British Interplanetary Society chairman Arthur C. Clarke was consulted. The cartoonist Norman Thelwell, who'd produced work for Anvil, was commissioned to draw a regular cartoon, as were writers and artists for other features. The ideas for Eagle developed further before reaching the final deadline, and various prototypes were produced, including this one on the left, apparently of issue 2, though it's not numbered, which makes me wonder if it was actually intended to be the number 1. I'm showing it with the cover of the published issue 2 for comparison. By this stage, Dan Dare had become a space pilot, as I've said, though his uniform was still blue rather than the eventual green. Interestingly, this copy is dated 10th of March, indicating that at one stage a third of March launch date might have been planned. This later preview issue of number 1 is dated the 21st of April, but the eventual launch date of 14th of April was brought forward from the 21st because of fears that another company was about to produce a rival product. Prior to publication, there was a massive publicity operation put in place, funded by Holton Press. Cars travelled the country sporting giant eagles on their roofs, and coupons were handed out, which, if you were lucky enough to have one, could be exchanged for a copy of Eagle at your local newsagents. And advertisements were placed in numerous magazines and newspapers, including all of Holton's titles. This one's from Lilliput. And then Eagle arrived, and this is what it looked like, which we've already seen today. No doubt we'll see again. Not all were as bright, and early copies often lacked the rich colour of later issues. New photogravure printing machines had been specially designed and built by Eric Bemrose at his Liverpool printing works, and they hadn't fully bedded in. Bringing the publication date forward hadn't helped. Even so, Eagle stood out from other papers. The first 2 pages were taken up with Dan Dare, scripted and drawn in colour by Hampson and members of his team. Dan Dare was followed by a police adventure strip in black and white, The Adventures of PC-49. Page 4 and page 5 were taken up with the first instalment of Plot Against the World, and that was followed by Captain Pugwash, a humorous strip written and drawn by John Ryan. Then, there was a half page on cricket coaching with advertisements for Biro pens and Ovaltine, and on the 7th page was The Spies Who Saved London, the first of a series on espionage and its techniques. Professor Britton explains, attempted to describe how radar works. And then on the first of a central section of colour pages was a western strip called Seth and Shorty, Cowboys. Now we get to the centre pages, which were occupied by two features in landscape format, a cutaway drawing of the then latest gas turbine railway locomotive and a strip called Skippy the Kangaroo. The next page carried two strips. Heroes of the Clouds told stories of aviation history. The second was a natural history strip, discovering the countryside. And then it was back to the black and white pages and real-life mysteries concerning a lost liner. Beneath it were a further 2-quarter page adverts, one for the Ministry of Transport to educate road safety, the other for Cadbury's and featuring a quiz. Page 14 featured two strips, making your own model racing car and sporting personalities. The Eagle Club and Editors page included a letter from the editor introducing the Eagle Club, to which readers could apply with the appropriate small fee for membership. It also included the concept of Eagle mugs, people who might be seen as mugs, but who would go out of their way to help others in need. Awards would be given to the Mug of the Month. There was a competition corner, and a coupon was provided for readers to take out a subscription. Also on this page was Chico, a 3-box cartoon strip by Norman Thelwell. Lash Lonergan's Quest gives the impression of being a Western adventure, but was in fact set in Australia. Then two more advertisements, a recruiting advert for the Army Apprenticeship School and the other for Rowntree's Fruit Gums. The last of the black and white pages had the opening episode of Rob Conway, written and drawn by Frank Hampson. And on the strip on page 19 was, strictly speaking, an advertising feature, since it was sponsored by Wall's Ice Cream, but was another Frank Hampson effort, Tommy Wall's The Wonder Boy. This was the nearest Holton's Eagle got to people with superhuman powers, and all through the wonders of Wall's Ice Cream. And so, the final page. And you might think that for a magazine that was seen initially as a machine for Christian propaganda, Eagle had little religion within it. The last page made up for this with the beginning of The Great Adventurer, the story of Saul of Tarsus who became St. Paul, another strip drawn initially by Hampson. So there we have it, in summary, Eagle magazine. The first issue had 20 pages, and it settled into a routine of 16 or 20 pages per issue, often determined by the advertising space needed. 8 pages were invariably colour and the rest black and white. Eagle is remembered as a comic. Norman Wright described it in 1986 as the most influential comic of the 1950s. But from the outset, Morris wanted to produce a magazine with a broad mix of content. He wanted to instill in his readers Christian values. He was, after all, a Church of England clergyman, and he wanted to cover most aspects of children's lives and well-being through their interest in fictional and factual stories told through words and pictures, while also nurturing their interest in sport, history, natural history, science, and technology. The nearest Eagle ever came to be called a comic by its editor was the New National Strip Cartoon Weekly. Although they'd achieved most of what they'd set out to with that first issue of Eagle, the team that produced it didn't rest on their laurels, job done. They continued to look for ways to improve Eagle. Frank Hampson's contribution to the first Eagle had been to 4 strips: Dan Dare, Tommy Walls, Rob Conway, and The Great Adventurer. Clearly this was too much to keep up for a weekly output, even with the support of the studio team. Eventually, as Hampson's other strips were dropped or handed over to others, the whole studio team would be dedicated to producing Dan Dare, and it became exclusively the Dan Dare studio. The Dan Dare stories were epic in scope, the first lasting 18 months. Well before it had ended, the Dan Dare studio moved south and Don Harley joined the team. The page shown here is from Safari in Space in 1959. And I would say that some of the best of Dan Dare was from the mid to late 50s. A tour de force was the Rogue Planet sequence, which began with The Man from Nowhere in May 1955 and completed 3 years later with The Ship That Lived. After Frank Hampson's departure from Dan Dare, Frank Bellamy would take over as lead artist and worked for a year on the strip with the remainder of Frank Hampson's studio team. PC-49 would become one of Eagle's favourite strips. Initially it was drawn by Strom Gould, but after 4 serial stories from August 1951 and for the rest of its run, it would be drawn by John Worsley, who was an accomplished war artist. The author Alan Stranks had originated PC-49 as a radio series, and initially it mirrored the characters he created for an adult audience, including PC-49's fiancée. As the series developed, the girlfriend was dropped, and the child characters of a boys' club, run by PC-49, would come to the fore. In March 1957, PC-49 was replaced by Mark Question, also written by Alan Stranks, but drawn by Harry Linfield. Text stories were always a feature of Eagle and took 3 forms: individual short stories, series of short stories, and serials. A short story of Arthur C. Clarke's The Fires Within was published during the first year under the pen name Charles Willis. I found out recently this is actually a reprint because it was actually published under a different pen name, I think in America. Serial stories included 2 Biggles Tales by Captain W.E. Johns. Rex Milligan was specifically created for Eagle by Anthony Buckeridge, whose other schoolboy character Jennings also occasionally featured in stories. But the longest running series of school-based stories was The 3 J's, written by Peter Ling and illustrated by Peter Kay. No, that's not the comedian. It ran from 1952 to 1959 and was a particular favourite of mine. Sports played a major part in Eagle through instructive cartoon features as well as photo-illustrated articles and features on sporting personalities. During its second year of publication, a regular Eagle Sports page appeared. Numerous Eagle Sports annuals would be published, and every year readers would vote for their favourite sports personality of the year. Factual text articles, often illustrated, covered many themes, but as Eagle developed, first-person accounts became popular. For example, Marcus Morris sent Charles Chilton to America to research for Riders of the Range, resulting in a series of articles from him. A major series was that of MacDonald Hastings, Eagle's special investigator, who would be sent off to all parts of the world to investigate and report on things of interest to the children of Britain, with articles such as In Search of the Little Yellow Men, involving a trip to the Kalahari Desert, or Calling All Flying Saucers, an investigation into UFOs. Science and technology were well represented and illustrated with illustrated text articles and centre-page cutaway drawings. In 1957, Eagle reported on the launch of artificial satellites with an article called Eagle Moon Prophecy Comes True, having earlier in 1955 anticipated the launch of artificial satellites on its cutaway drawings page. The cutaway drawing was the one feature of Eagle that lasted its entire run, although in later years it moved from the centre pages for a while to the back cover, and at other times it appeared in black and white inside. Cutaways covered all aspects of technology in air, sea, land and space, including civilian and military, and historic, then current and future projections. The main and most prolific artist of the cutaways was Leslie Ashwell Wood, who drew the first cutaway and 19 years later would draw its last. Other cutaway artists who drew for Eagle included J. Walton Fisher, Lawrence Dunn, Geoffrey Wheeler and John Batchelor. Natural history strips became a regular feature, usually as half-page colour strips. Some later strips would be by the then well-known naturalist, I nearly said naturist, George Cansdale. A variety of artists were employed, most notably G.W. Backhouse and Tom Adams. Tommy Walls ran for over 4 years, although Hampson stopped after 7 episodes. John Worsley would take over, followed by other artists, most notably Richard Jennings. In later years, Tommy Walls would be replaced by other strips, generally half-page features. This allowed natural history strips, for example, to be moved onto the page and freed up the fourth of the centre section colour pages. In turn, this allowed a new strip, Jack-o'-lantern, to be introduced. This full-colour strip, set in the days of highwaymen, was written by George Beardmore and drawn by Robert Ayton, though towards the end of the run, illustrator C.L. Doughty took over. Jack-o'-lantern was another of Eagle's great strips, and the storylines hold up even today. It's remarkable that it's never seen any reprint editions. From 1961 till 1962, it would be replaced by Fraser of Africa, also written by George Beardmore, but drawn by Frank Bellamy after his year on Down Dare. The Great Adventurer would eventually be taken over by Norman Williams and would run for a year. Subsequently, the back page carried numerous biographical strips, some with a religious bent, others more secular. Strips included The Happy Warrior, the life story of the then still living Winston Churchill, which was Frank Bellamy's first work for Eagle. Frank Hampson's last work on Eagle was another back page feature, The Road of Courage, the story of Christ, which was written by Marcus Morris. But what happened to the first Eagle's less successful elements and what replaced them? After a couple of weeks of Frank Hampson drawing it, Greta Tomlinson and Harold Johns would take over Rob Conway, but had to wind up the story 15 weeks in. For some time the page would be occupied by Harris Tweed, but it would eventually be filled by Storm Nelson's Sea Adventurer, a sea-based story that saw Storm Nelson and his private navy, the Silver Fleet, engaged in exploits all over the oceans of the world. Written by Guy Morgan under the pen name Edward Trice and drawn by Richard Jennings, it was a highly successful series that would run from 1953 until 1962. Seth and Shorty Cowboys also finished after 15 weeks, to be replaced with the story of Cortez drawn by William Stobbs. But eventually a Western strip would return in the shape of Jeff Arnold and the Riders of the Range, written by Charles Chilton. Like PC-49, Riders of the Range was an import from radio, as it originated as a Songs Around the Campfire show for the BBC, where Chilton was its writer and producer. When the radio show finished, Chilton would write and produce the Journey into Space serials that so enthralled many of us in the 1950s. Jeff Arnold was a very popular strip, featuring not only in Eagle and Eagle Annual, but also having its own series of annuals, not to mention merchandise. Jeff Arnold went through a couple of artists before finding the ideal artist in Frank Humphreys, a Western enthusiast. Together, Chilton and Humphreys would produce some of the most historically accurate stories of the Old West. Historically accurate, that is, apart from the inclusion of the fictional Jeff Arnold and his sidekick Luke amongst the action. Now, apart from Chico, which appeared as a 3-panel strip on the editorial page and would run until 1962, the humorous strips of Eagle's first issue didn't fare well. Captain Pugwash would disappear from Eagle after 19 weeks, and in retrospect it's easy to see why, as its audience was likely to be on average younger than that for most of the other Eagle content. It would be replaced by the much more successful Harris Tweed, Extra Special Agent. John Ryan, who wrote and drew both strips, would later resurrect Captain Pugwash as a very popular animated television programme and series of books. Harris Tweed would run from 1950 until 1962, the first 4 years being in full-page black and white. After that it would be a half-page. It would get retitled a couple of times, ending up as Harris Tweed Super Sleuth, and along the way it became a colour strip. Skippy the Kangaroo was another strip that didn't quite fit the model that was being established for Eagle. Along with Captain Pugwash, it would probably have been more suited to Swift, had that existed at the time. It would be replaced by the legend of the Lincoln Imp, and later by the first translation and publication of Hergé's Adventures of Tintin. Later still, its space would be occupied by another of Eagle's famous adventure strips, Luck of the Legion, written by Geoffrey Bond and drawn by Martin Aitchison. This was, I believe, the only long-running strip series in Eagle to have been written and drawn throughout by a single writer-artist team. Although Luck of the Legion featured regularly in Eagle Annual, it never had its own annual, although a number of books were written by Aitchison. The Eagle Club achieved a membership of 60,000 after just 2 issues, and I believe it peaked at something around 200,000 members. Soon, many activities would be organised for Eagle Club members and readers: painting competitions, the Holton's Boys and Girls exhibition, adventure holidays, annual carol services at St Paul's Cathedral, to name a few. Eagle was initially intended as a children's magazine, but its main readership was boys. Once it was firmly established, Morris gradually launched Eagle's companion papers: Girl in 1951, Robin for Infants in 1953, and Swift in 1954. Swift was aimed at bridging the age gap between Robin and Eagle or Girl, as Eagle and Girl were more focused on a supposed 10 to 14-year demographic. 1951 also saw the first Eagle Annual, itself the first of many other annuals and books on multifarious subjects. It's my view that the overall quality of Eagle's content with respect to its key cartoon strips achieved a plateau around 1956 with the arrival of Jack-O-Lantern. That plateau ended during 1962, when most of Eagle's leading strips were killed off. Eagle's decline, which I won't dwell upon, began after a series of publisher takeovers, the first being the Oddham's takeover of Holton Press in 1960, when it was renamed Longacre Press. Oddham's was taken over by the Mirror Group, which became IPC and later Fleetway. The new owners gave little thought to the unique nature of Eagle, and especially Dan Dare with its expensive team producing it, and the Dan Dare studio was eventually disbanded. Marcus Morris left to join the National Magazine Company. Frank Hampson left Eagle after completing The Road of Courage. A year earlier, he'd drawn what was to be his last Dan Dare page. I think most readers who came across Eagle in the 1950s would agree that after Morris's and Hampson's departures, and certainly after about 1962 or 1963, it was in decline. This impression was not helped when Dan Dare was removed as a cover feature and reduced to black and white inside. There was some good work after that date, and there are many good strips in it, including Frank Bellamy's work on Montgomery of Alamein and Heros the Spartan. And Keith Watson did very much to restore Dan Dare, but 1967 would see the last original Dan Dare story in Eagle. After that, it would be hacked about reprints of Dan Dare until the sad end of Eagle in 1969. In its day and to this, Eagle has influenced other publications. Comics like Lion from Amalgamated Press, Express Weekly from Beaverbrook, and the short-lived Rocket from News of the World were published as rivals to Eagle, with their own space-based characters. Later, TV Century 1 clearly derived much from Eagle's format. Strangely, in the 1960s, after their acquisition of Eagle, the short-lived Boys' World was set up by Oddham's as a direct competitor with Eagle. Later artists have been inspired by the artistic realism of Dan Dare. For example, Chris Weston, who invoked a 1950s retro look for Ministry of Space, acknowledges the inspiration of artists like Frank Hampson. Publishers knew the name of Eagle and Dan Dare, and there have been various attempts to bring them back with variable success. An attempt by IPC to relaunch Eagle in the 1970s, there's a dummy picture there, came to nothing. In 1977, 2000 AD was supposed to be the platform to relaunch Dan Dare, but the character was distorted out of all recognition from Hampson's creation. The new Eagle came out in 1982, bringing back cutaway drawings and rather than the original Dan Dare, his great-great-grandson, until a change in policy saw the original return, drawn again by Keith Watson. But these and the other reinventions of Dan Dare have gone. Along the way, there have been various reprint editions of material from Eagle, mostly but not exclusively Dan Dare. But it took someone who was a real appreciator of Dan Dare to bring back the hero just as we knew him with the launch of Spaceship Away in 2003. You'll be hearing more about that in the next talk by Rod. I think it's pretty obvious that Eagle and Dan... Oh, sorry, let's change slides. I think it's pretty obvious that Eagle and Dan Dare are embedded in the cultural fabric of Britain. In science and technology, in architecture, music, art and journalism, and no doubt other spheres too, for Eagle had an encyclopedic appeal. Outside of the Eagle Society and today's gathering, just a few examples of people I've heard of it who've acknowledged the influence of Eagle or Dan Dare. Professor Stephen Hawking, when asked about Dan Dare, said, "Why am I a cosmologist?" The late Professor Colin Pillinger, the man behind Beagle 2, who talked to us shortly before the launch of it, in 2003, was it? Richard Branson, the founder of Virgin Galactic, who was whose Virgin Comics also published a Dan Dare comic. The architect Norman Foster. The inventor James Dyson. Elton John and the punk band The Mekons, that have each written and performed songs about Dan Dare. Gerald Scarfe referred to Eagle as giving him his big break by publishing a cartoon of his when he was 16. Dan Dare references are frequently made in the media. Only a few days ago, this cartoon appeared in the Times. Clearly, although Eagle was short-lived, it had a major impact on many of the generation that read it, providing a model for their inspiration. In my case, I started reading Eagle in 1954, when Dan Dare was in the middle of the Prisoners of Space story. I was instantly enthralled and started buying a copy every week. One week I missed an episode, and I decided to take out a regular subscription. It would be some years before I found out how Dan escaped the Mekon's deadly gas chamber in that missing episode. Then I stopped reading Eagle in 1962, believing I'd grown out of it, but now realising it was also because its decline had begun. Now I know I'm not alone in crediting Dan Dare, along with 50s movies like The Conquest of Space, the space fiction of Arthur C. Clarke, the radio serial Journey into Space, for my youthful enthusiasm for the prospect of space travel, which many back then thought far-fetched. After leaving school, I joined the Space Department at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, where I worked in spacecraft propulsion for 25 years, until 1988. After that, I moved to another department, which was not rocket science, though my interest continued. Meanwhile, I became reacquainted with Eagle in 1979, attracted inevitably into a shop at Cambridge Circus in London by the profusion of copies of Eagle in its window, each copy bearing that familiar red box with its Eagle symbol. I inevitably bought a copy, for old time's sake, and began my Eagle collecting career. On a later visit to the shop, I came across this leaflet, advertising the existence of the Astral Group. Hence began my membership of the group of people who now call ourselves the Eagle Society. But the roots of today's Eagle Society were planted in the days of Eagle itself. In 1964, Eric Mackenzie had a letter published in Eagle. He was looking for a pen pal with similar interests. A few months later, a second letter declared his intention to set up a Dan Dare Club with fellow enthusiast Andrew Skilleter. Soon the Dan Dare Club was publishing a regular newsletter, which from January 1966 became a magazine, Astral, the official journal of the International Dan Dare Club. After Astral folded in late 1967, there were attempts to re-kickstart the club, such as a one-off magazine called Ultima Thule, and John Woodland published four issues of New Astral in the following years. Then in 1975, Adrian Perkins and Simon Garrett started the Astral Group, publishing numerous news sheets. From 1979, Charles Gunther and Alan Whitehead edited the Astral Group newsletter. Its third issue celebrated Eagle's 30th anniversary, and that year saw the celebration of Eagle with EagleCon 80. And from July 1981 until May 1982, Adrian Perkins edited and published Dan Dare Recalled, or the Astral Group Members Forum, to alternate with the publication of the newsletter. 1983 saw the publication of Eagler magazine, jointly edited and produced by Charles Evans Gunther and Alan Whitehead. 5 issues appeared until 1986, when the editors handed the reins over to Howard Korn and Chris Hall to produce Eagle Days, promoted as companion to Astral Group newsletter, Astral Forum and Eagler. Joined by John Wharton, Chris and Howard would publish 7 issues of Eagle Days before the mysterious departure of Mr. Hall, which is a tale I won't be telling today. But an emergency meeting of interested parties resulted in the start of a new magazine for Eagle enthusiasts, Eagle Times. The first Eagle Times appeared in 1988. Little did its editorial team then think that Eagle Times would still be being published in 2015, with an original instigator, Howard Korn, still at the helm. Eagle Times is now in its 28th year, which is remarkable for a publication which commemorates a publication which itself only lasted 19 years. In that time, annual gatherings have been held all over the country, invariably at places with an Eagle connection. The 40th, 50th and 60th anniversaries of Eagle were all celebrated in Southport, the place of Eagle's birth. When did the Eagle Society begin? Well, the first time that Eagle Times carried the legend Journal of the Eagle Society was Eagle Times Volume 4, Number 1. But undoubtedly the group is sustained by a continuity from the earliest days of Eagle. Looking back, the 19 years of Eagle was a comparatively short existence. But those years, 1950 to 1969, were years of major change in Britain and in the world. It's remarkable to me that in 1950, when Eagle started, many still thought space travel impossible. Even in 1956, the Astronomer Royal was quoted as saying, "Space travel is utter bilge." I think it was a bit misquoted, actually. But those who read the Eagle certainly knew it was not. When Eagle was first published, it would be another 7 years before the first artificial satellite was launched. And by July 1969, only 12 years after that, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin declared, "The Eagle has landed from the surface of the moon," somewhat ironically for fans of Dan Dare, their Eagle, the magazine, had already ended. Yet the memory of Eagle and its legacy continue to the present day. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. Perfect time.
Okay.
Although we could, anybody got any? Ah, well done.
Just looking for the microphone.
Yeah.
Is there any questions?
This is purely so that we can record everything and put it on the website. So if anyone doesn't want their talks recorded, please let us know. Now, any questions? You seem to have all learnt it all. Oh, there's one.
Revises you to magnificent bilge.
Well, I think what he actually said was all this talk about space travel was utter bilge, and then he pointed out the expensive nature of doing space exploration, and perhaps he thought it could be better spent elsewhere. But but he didn't quite say it's utter bilge. He didn't say it wasn't possible.
Right. You mentioned there that the various serials within the comic came and went.
Yeah.
How was the success of individual elements within the paper judged?
Well, they did do surveys, reader surveys, to establish which were the successful ones and which weren't.
Mm-hmm. Sort of original market research or letters from
they did a lot of,
readers and so on.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, but these days, of course, they do the market research first, rather than putting it in and seeing how well it does.
Yes.
And therefore, everything comes out as, well, it's what's already out there, rather than innovative stuff.
Just to follow on with that, you sometimes got letters into the Eagle to the editor complimenting them on the particular strips
Yes,
that
they
were
did,
running.
yes, yeah. I'm sure they got a few that said, no, we don't like this.
I noticed there was no mention, although it was his name did appear on one of the Eagle Times features there, of Chad Vara, who founded the Samaritans.
Yes.
And of course he did a lot in the religious pages that you had at the back of the page.
He did. He wrote one of the serial stories that was in the first issue.
Yeah.
He wrote a lot of material. I mean, he was also trained in science, and he wrote the whole of the second Dan Dare story.
Did he?
Yeah.
Well, just in your mentions, and because I'm in a befuddled state, I forgot to produce it, but I have a copy of The Private Eye. It was last year, I think. It's got the lookalike series, you know, where they do to it. So people can see it. I've got it with me of Tim Peake and Dan Dare.
Oh yes, yes, yes. Didn't they have the captions swapped round?
Yeah. No, this was the lookalikes. They also did a Dan Dare strip much earlier. That's right, Dan Dare.
Right. Any other questions? Yes, one at the back there.
Just to say, I've been an Eagle enthusiast for a very long time, and I have known Will for a long time. But I have to say, I thought that was an extremely erudite and condensed talk. Very helpful for people who may not know everything as much as some of us. I wonder if you might touch on the international publications of Dan Dare that people might not be aware of. Obviously, we're here today to talk about his influence in this country, but his repeats around the world.
Yeah, there were other comics versions of Eagle in different countries.
I was sponsored to go to Zagreb by the council in the good old communist days when money's no object. I actually went there and gave a talk on Dan Dare, which is what it was in Croatian.
Yeah,
You know,
I think I've got a feeling the Croatian one wasn't actually officially licensed. I think they just reprinted it.
Absolutely,
because they could.
There's a lot of stories about that.
But there was an Australian Eagle. There was Scandinavian countries had them, and Dan Dare was featured in France in lots of different.
Can I just ask? Just out of interest, how many people remember the Dan Dare radio show on Radio Luxembourg?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
There are a few.
Yeah, I don't recall being able to understand what was going on because it kept coming and going.
just because it was ripped off, it didn't mean to say that the fans were any less enthusiastic.
Oh no.
And in fact, because the communist empire ripped off stuff from the West, that was like a Trojan horse into the culture. Because when I get over there, there's a lot of people remember. For example, Harry Harrison became one of the best writers in Russia because all his books were ripped off in France.
Just on the international aspect, when I joined the Atomic Energy Authority in 1976, I was working with an Egyptian plasma physicist named Kamal Khalafallah, and I had to share an office with him, and we suddenly discovered Dan Dare in common. And apparently in Cairo, he used to get the Eagle shipped out to him every week in order that he could follow Dan Dare.
We used to get it in Malaya as well.
Yeah.
There's one over here.
Well, thank you, Alfred. Like the gentleman who just mentioned the Radio Luxembourg radio series of Dan Dare, two other, I don't know what quite to call them Dan Dare curiosities. I used to get the Meccano magazine every month, and I remember seeing an advert in it for either 8mm or 16mm movie that you could buy depicting a Dan Dare story. And I remember the illustration that went with the advert was drawn very much in the Frank Hampson style. Now, I never saw that. I mean, I wasn't able, pocket money wouldn't stretch to buying it, nor did we have a cine projector at home. But I've never really been able to find out any more about that. The other thing is, just recently, and I just remembered this, I came across online a reworking of the original Dan Dare story where they went to Venus, with all the original illustrations, but as a slideshow online with voiceovers of the Okay, all right. Oh, you're aware of that. Okay, I thought it was really quite good.
Yeah, I think they used the soundtrack from the BBC adaptation.
Yeah, they did. That's right. I didn't much care for that adaptation. That was just CGI thing. I didn't care so much.
No, this was the radio one.
Oh, no, sorry. But there was, I think on Channel 4 they did something, a version of Dan Dare, a very much updated one. Thank you.
One last question, because we don't want to lose our time.
It's just a memory. You talk about the influence the eagle had. One of the things I always remember, the influence in our house when the eagle was delivered in the morning. And it would drop onto the mat, and my father and I would charge. And it wasn't very edifying. Best way I could liken it is two billy goats trying to eat out the same trough. And it would have been done for mild child abuse these days, I think.
Well, thank you very much. Oh,
I'm sorry, I think
waving at us. Thank you very much. That's excellent.